Okay, good morning. I want to welcome everybody to our seminar on negotiating incentives, land costs, and energy costs. Once again, presented by Mark Williams, the president of Strategic Development Group. SDG has completed highly successful site location projects with major U.S. corporations and multinationals based in Europe and Asia, including Bridgestone, British Petroleum, Tupperware, and Commercial Metals Corp., among others. And Mark is going to be talking about how you evaluate incentives and how you negotiate the best deals for your site location. Please welcome Mark Williams.
And so they didn't, you know, I wanted a lavalier. I described myself earlier sort of like a shark. If I'm not wandering around, I can't talk. So I'm gonna wander around. If the doors stay open, I may get in the back there. Who knows? But let me just start. I'll give you an overview of our company and what we do. There are a number of slides, but again, frankly, I'll stick to the slides, but I'd really rather have a dialogue with y'all. So interrupt with questions or whatever you like, and we'll get started. So, got to stay away from that. Strategic Development Group is a site location firm founded about 17 years ago. Small firm, sort of big clients, can't explain why. We're based in South Carolina, and sort of our niche is helping big global companies locate facilities in the U.S. So we've worked in probably 45 out of 50 states. Some smaller companies, things you recognize, British Petroleum, et cetera, et cetera. So as far as I know, we do all of Bridgestone's U.S. work. We'll look at a couple of their projects in a minute. So just, again, some background on our perspective. It's heavy manufacturing. I want to show you a couple of projects we've announced in the last 6 or 8 months. This is a steel mill. And this is a Commercial Metals company. It's a Fortune 200 steelmaker. And they're building a mill that's going to look just like this in Durant, Oklahoma, which is just north of Dallas. So that was about a 1.5-year project that we worked on. This is a company from Bangkok that we worked with this year. This is an ethane cracker in beautiful Lake Charles, Louisiana. This was an interesting search because we had to look at existing cracker facilities. This particular facility had been mothballed for 30 years. And we went in, we negotiated the deal for the facility with Oxy Chemical. And as always interesting in negotiations, Louisiana offered a wonderful package, but the fuel crisis hit, their tax revenues plummeted, and we had to do a little dance at the end to make sure we got what we were promised, but it worked out well. And we also do a fair amount of headquarters. This is Bridgestone's headquarters, which is under construction in Nashville, Tennessee. If you've been to Nashville, you'll appreciate this building. It's going to change the skyline. It's about 550,000 square feet, 30-some stories high, 2-year project, ultra secretive because it's really sensitive, about what employees know and don't know. Dean, this was 100 yards from the Guild Conference. I don't know if you got over there to look at it. But, we started with 10 cities and lots of site selection parameters and got down to 3 cities, Nashville, Chicago, and Atlanta. Got to negotiate with Rahm Emanuel, which was an interesting experience. We told him we weren't locating there, and my house it's still there, actually. My house has not been destroyed. Anyhow, so let's just talk about some basic things, at least from our perspective, and then we'll move into various kinds of incentives, and hopefully you'll be interjecting. So we see several key phases of a client project. The first we call alignment. It's just so critical. Particularly, I think if you're from the economic development perspective, I think the real value we add to you as a consultant is we need to be in the head of our client in terms of what drives their decision. If we are not in their head and can't communicate that to you, from my perspective, we're virtually worthless to you. because a lot of times you don't have client contact. So first thing we do, I really wanted to be a psychologist. This is sort of like a focus group too. When you go in with a client in the beginning and you say, what's driving your project? And a lot of times they'll tell you, well, definitely these things. And then maybe by the end of the conversation, some other things have occurred because we start to ask why. Why this? Why that? Why do you think you need this? So alignment's the beginning. Then we go out and solicit sites. We do due diligence on these sites. This is a rapidly changing environment where 15 years ago we would have driven to see or flown to see 15 or 20 sites to start, and the internet has allowed us in many ways, and other databases have allowed us many ways to narrow before an extensive field visit. We'll shortlist. It's always about narrowing, right? We'll shortlist, and then we'll typically negotiate incentives toward the end of a project, but I think our perspective on incentives, even though it's shown at the end, is we believe incentive negotiation starts the minute you step out of the car, the minute you walk out of the plane. And when we talk about negotiation, I'm talking from our client's perspective, and we're negotiating on their behalf. It may be with the state government, it may be a local government, it may be a railroad, it may be an electric utility, landowner, but it's important to set the stage and set up a competitive environment of sites that will absolutely work for the project. From our perspective, competitive leverage in negotiating. And I think what a lot of people forget is you really need to have, in my opinion, 2 workable sites toward the end of a deal that will work. 1 out of 10 times a site, something has critical failure for some reason. And so we see a lot of companies, maybe they come to us even after they've done this, they've gone through a 1.5-year process or a long process, and then they find they have an environmental issue or this issue or that issue. So we believe we should shortlist 2 or 3 sites for 2 primary reasons. One is we need a backup site that will absolutely work, and the other is we have no leverage or very little leverage unless we're real creative, unless we have a very viable competing site. So these are the stages of a project as we see them. And this is a rank of site selection factors from a publication. It comes out every year. And I just, it's interesting if you just look at the top one, availability of skilled labor has gone from 2014 rank of 5th most important to number 1. I mean, this is something we see more and more as a critical factor in what people are looking for in site locations. And, we'll talk more about why that is, but a lot of it has to do with capital intensity and wringing more value out of locations. Employees have to be really on the mark. So what matters most in site location? A few things here. One is site readiness. If you don't have a site that'll work or it can be verified that can work within a reasonably short period of time, you're probably not going to have a lot of luck on the economic development front if you're in the site location business. This takes all kinds of forms. If you ask me personally, some of it's smoke and mirrors. There's site certification programs. Maybe some of those are good. Maybe some of them aren't. We can talk about that offline when I'm not being recorded. But site readiness and having something to sell, whether for an industrial purpose or an office purpose or whatever, if that's not there, there's really not much sense in looking, because our clients have shorter and shorter time periods where they need to make decisions, and they sure aren't going to wait around to find out if you can pull a piece of property together, whether the owners want to sell it, whether it has wetlands issues, geotechnical issues, other issues. Just not going to go through all that. Too high risk, too high risk. Logistics, principally in manufacturing and distribution, global trade, all that good stuff. Logistics, an increasingly important factor in site location decisions. We mentioned workforce quality and availability. That quality and availability is increasingly important in the financial case. The financial case is always important. We're typically, when we work with our clients, we're going to look in sort of 2 realms. One is a qualitative realm, things you can't measure, things that might not be financial, quality of life, etc. But the other realm is the quantitative. And so we're going to have a spreadsheet, not really rocket science, but in a project we're going to have a spreadsheet and we're going to spread cost over 15 or 20 years. We're going to spread incentives over 15 or 20 years. If we think there's a 30% probability we're going to get the incentive, we mark it down by 70%. And we're going to take all the apples, oranges, peaches, and pears of what these different entities have given us, and we're going to discount it to net present value or some kind of ROI, and we're going to have a financial case. So that's always critical. Some projects, particularly maybe a headquarters project that's focused on recruiting millennials, may care less about a financial case. It just depends on what the goals of the client are. Smile.
I don't know anything about a headquarters search.
So
you said you wanted, do you have a question? See, otherwise you wanted this to be interactive. So what was driving, for example, the bridge stone? Was it cost? Was it millennials? Can you say?
Yeah, I can say that project was interesting because you had a CEO and he wanted to consolidate. He had different sort of castles around the country, so he wanted to consolidate them under one roof for efficiency. So we had a Chicago castle, an Indianapolis castle, and a Nashville campus primarily. So costs were critical. I mean, when you looked at the numbers, when you spread the numbers for Chicago versus a Nashville, my gosh, it was profoundly different. So that was important. The most interesting thing to me in that project was we had my group and 2 or 3 executives from the company doing this for well over a year. And so you had a CEO, you had a board member, chief administrative person, and then you had this 32-year-old woman who was the financial person, clearly on the rise in the company, and her job, other than being real smart and real intuitive, was to sniff out the millennial factor. So we're flying around on their jet so she could, land and get that feel, and I don't know if she was counting Starbucks or what she was doing, but it was the first time I really ever experienced this personally. And so I hear more and more about that because, I employ probably 1.5 millennials, and it's an interesting ride. Okay? Well, the other role is to make people look good, right? So there's a governor looking good, a secretary of commerce looking good. That's sort of the goal, right? But the other goal is this is a pretty interesting graph of what's been happening since 1990. If you look at the number of jobs, and you've seen variations of this, the number of jobs is in red, right? So in this period of time, the number of jobs is really declined. The investment, or the productivity, is increasing. So in essence, we're squeezing so much more out of so many fewer people that those skill levels and that productivity and that location and all those factors that ring out quality and productivity are more critical than ever. So we see ourselves where it used to be, gee, tell us about your training programs and let's go through all that. We see people saying, let's go over to the elementary school. Let's look at the budget for K through 12. There's a factor out there, the way you determine the prison population, or the way many areas determine how many prison beds to build is the reading level in 3rd grade, okay? So this is increasingly a factor, and this is why right here. So in terms of incentives, training is certainly important, but getting some sense of what that pipeline of talent and people is critically important too. Why else do states and regions pursue economic development projects? Well, this is another project that I don't know if you've seen the in-plan analysis for economic impact, but this was a 1,500-person headquarters project in Chicago. And if you're familiar with this, there's a direct effect, there's an indirect effect. So this is what the project itself does on an annual basis from a financial perspective. This is what the people supplying it directly do, the operations, and this is what everybody else does as a result of these. So When we ran this project through the model, the annual economic impact was projected at $660 million a year. So you start to see, well, if maybe we're going to induce this thing somehow. That's a lot of cash for a city or a region or a state. So you see states going all out for projects and communities and utilities, and some of them have really good reason to do that. And so what's happening with that? If you look through time, this is about 1995 through last year, this line represents the average value of incentives offered per job. So you start down in 2000 at maybe 180,000 on average per job, and now we're up close to 1 million. So the incentive packages are getting more and more robust as time goes on. So it's an important point to negotiate. Please.
This is over the life of the project, correct?
This is.
Everybody was getting, 250,000 in 1995. That was over a 10-year projected, or is that per job?
This is, if you took deals in the 1995 time period and averaged them together, they're getting about this much per job in incentives.
Over the life of
No, it's the package offer, okay? Over the life, some of it's initial, some of it's, and then as time goes on, that package value over the life continues to increase on an approximate basis. So we have a lot of clients that come to us and well, some of them say, well, tell us about incentives. And generally our approach, I have to say, is tell us about the operation. We've got to get the operation in the right place for the long term to be successful. And then we got to get the right incentives too. We've just written an article that we'll publish shortly. We call it the 10 costliest errors in site selection. A lot of it has to do with incentives. Picking a site based on incentives, for example, that's not in a great operational location is a forever of cost, labor issues, other issues. So there are lots of people out there, maybe they're represented by people like us or not, but to select a site purely on incentives is an issue. If you're in the economic development field, we can talk in a minute, but if somebody walks in and all they want is incentives in the beginning, you got to be a little skeptical about what their motivations are. They're smoking you out because they've got another location they really like, they want to set up some competition, so on and so forth. No more questions. Nobody's on that side of the curtain, right? They're all, there's one guy on a table back there. No? Okay. So what's the role of incentives in site selection? Well, it needs to be part of an overall strategy, because if you're a significant entity in this game, you gotta have some thinking done about how it's going to proceed for you, because you're going to be asked the question. Okay, so it's part of your strategy. You want to meet the needs of the companies locating. You want to enhance the strengths you have in every site, every house, anything you buy probably has some weaknesses, so you're going to use it to mitigate weaknesses. And incentives are important if they impact a decision. If they don't impact a decision, then maybe you shouldn't offer them, or you should offer less. It's always been amazing to me, and I was in the public sector for, I don't know, about 10 years, worked for 2 governors, and then this most recent career, about 20 years. And it's always been amazing to me how a state might have this big project and they're rampantly negotiating incentives, but they don't know anything about the competition. It's fascinating. And I remember one time in particular when I worked in government, we had a big project and my boss, the secretary, was out of town. He was hunting animals in Africa. And I called him up one night. I said, he said, how'd it go today? And he said, well, these people walked out. I told them we weren't going to give them any more. And he said, well, why'd you do that? I said, because I had our team drive to the competing site in Georgia earlier this week, I see no survey flags, no drill rigs, no nothing. There is nothing going on where these people are talking. Anyway, so we ended up getting that deal, but you got to know what your competition's doing, or you got to try to know what your competition is doing. And I got to tell you, what's in their website ain't what's really going on. I mean, what we do in our company, frankly, for the sectors we focus on, every major deal we FOIA. We FOIA every major deal in the country. So if we do a lot of tire work, we know what GD got, we know what Yokohama got, we know what Hankook got. We're going to do a Freedom of Information request, and we're going to get all their agreements, and we're going to study those. So they're very nice, legitimate ways to figure out what the playing field is. But it's not what's written on these people's websites. It's just not. So let's talk about incentives real quick. Recurring and non-recurring. Any questions, thoughts? Thank you.
I'm sorry.
No, you shouldn't be.
I would love to hear, and you may be adding it later, how much, the true value of what companies are able to really access in terms of the amount of incentives. Are they always able to get 100% by their own admission? Do they meet the job requirements for any of those specifications?
Let me answer now because I'll forget, or try to. So I think your question is, so typically,
They're offered this, do they get this, or do they usually get something a little less?
well, some incentives are performance-based.
Correct.
And if they don't perform, or it's scaled, so they get what they perform. Other incentives are probably performance-based, but not on a sliding scale. So if they don't meet a certain threshold, maybe there's a clawback, or maybe they don't get it at all.
But my question is, after 20 years in the business, do your clients, because you have really large clients. I know the answer for my clients because my clients are usually small to medium cap. So, but do your clients usually get what they think they're going to get? Looking back at the project.
Well, two comments. One is, we just put all those big companies up to make us look better, but we have lots of smaller companies we work for, okay? First point. Number two, we always try to exceed their expectations, both on the operational side, which is the most important, and the incentive side. So many of these companies come in with a photocopy of the website, and well, they want these things, but we generally always divert from that in some way. Things that we need that they never would have thought of. It's really best, I think, from a public policy perspective, if my client has something they want that's very valuable to them and not very valuable to the, let's call it, public entity, wow, that's a really good thing. So we want to name the road to our new plant site Giant Tire Parkway. Wow, we put up a street sign, no big deal, but that's great, right? So just depends. So non-recurring costs. These are costs that these companies are going to experience up front. And remember this net present value model, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but your costs in the beginning of the project are most impactful to you because they're at present value. As you go through time, those costs, their value erodes. So costs that happen in the beginning are the most impactful, the most negative, and generally from an incentive perspective, the more of that you can get rid of or mitigate, the better it'll be in terms of that analysis. So site preparation, clearing, cutting, drainage, paving, all this stuff, anything related to developing a site is critically important, particularly to a manufacturer. Yes, sir?
How does that compare to pre-existing second-generation sites that you want to rehab?
Well, I would call it a brownfield, or maybe it doesn't have environmental issues. I mean, if the cost of redevelopment is significant in the beginning, for whatever reason, earth has to be moved or there's environmental remediation because the site existed, those costs are just as negative, right? I sat behind you in another appointment. I mean, you're on the corporate side, correct? And so you're going to want to mitigate or reduce or eliminate as much of that as you can.
I totally get that, but what I'm asking is, let's say you have a non-performing piece of real estate in the county that's pretty dilapidated, and I set my eyes on it, I want to rehab it, infuse, let's say, millions to rehab it. How does that compare to doing something from the ground up? Is it similar incentives or not?
I think it really depends on the appetite and attitude of that local group. If they really want that dilapidated piece of property developed, not just for the investment and jobs that you bring, but for aesthetic reasons, to give it new life. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons. They may be even more motivated to help with that than a greenfield facility. So I think that, you know, this whole game is about communication. If you're the client or we represent you, so what's important to you, but that community has needs too, right? They have things they want to accomplish, and that's what's important about the dialogue of negotiation from my perspective is, I don't want you just hearing from us. I want to know what's important to you as a community or a utility. In many cases, a community, for whatever reason, is willing to be a loss leader in something. Or a railroad may be willing to be a loss leader. They may install a lead track a long way to get to you at the end because they see development potential along the way. So they're motivated by that. So you got to smoke them out in a positive way.
And pardon me if I jump the gun.
Please.
You know, as far as from your perspective, let's say I hire you, I know it could go two different ways. You either go a fixed fee or you do a contingent fee based on a percentage of the incentives. Okay.
Those are options. There are other ones. I mean, I have a couple of contracts in my briefcase if you want to chat it. No, no, but we've worked all kinds of different ways based on what victory is for our clients. Some of them have nothing to do with that. Pardon me?
I don't know if they're your competitor or not, but they gave me a quote.
Ah.
They want a fixed fee. And I'm kind of leery of fixed fees because obviously there are no guarantees with incentives.
Yeah. So just a little 30-second sales blurb. We, not always, but generally have a time and expense component and a bonus component. Our perspective on performance bonuses is we've never had a client that wasn't absolutely delighted to pay one because we had set some goal in the beginning. It may have been related to incentives. A lot of times it's not. BP, for example, called us a few years ago, and they had a big plastics company they wanted to locate next to one of their production facilities. And that plastics company was about to announce in Montreal, Quebec. They called us and said, look, we want you to work for us, and we'll pay you time and expense. And the bonus was related not to incentives. It was related to, could we turn this whole situation around and get that thing right next to them? And that's what we did. So it just depends on what value is there for you. You have to be careful, I think, with bonuses related to incentives. That's real tricky. It can create a lot of negative goodwill with some of these people. If you push too hard, you can be led, I think, in the wrong direction by not understanding the value of those incentives. Maybe you would have gotten them anyway. I mean, what value did that consultant provide? So it just depends. Yes, sir.
This is a often left field question, but have you ever had any luck in getting county road crews to do the site preparation? They have all the people, all the equipment, and that would be a match from the county that they could do off of some cost. And I get looked at like I've got three heads. They go, well, we've got 300 people sitting around the road crew, we've got heavy equipment, but and our own gravel pit, and we're a mile from where you need it. Why would we fit the site? Can't we get money from somewhere else?
Yes, we've seen that done. Not all the time, but we've seen that done. Sometimes our clients like to carefully control that process. They may even want to do the work themselves and be reimbursed for it because they want to control that spec. You know, they want that compaction just right. You know, they want all that just right. So it just depends on how that goes. But yes, I've seen that.
As a consumer, I'd be so leery of that, trying to control government to give you a timeline for, delivery.
That's another issue. That's another issue.
Depends on how far you are from heavy equipment contractors, people with the time to do it.
Still gonna be 3 managers trying to manage one guy to finish the job.
But it's his idiot nephew he's managing, so.
Pros and cons, okay? Land is a non-recurring immediate cost. Land is fascinating to me because when you run land through pro forma on most deals, it doesn't much matter. But there's a psychological factor for many companies and many geographic cultures where that just has, particularly some foreign cultures, it just has profound meaning. That a group would provide land. I mean, I've been sort of looking at it for almost 25, 30 years. It's hard to understand, but it has great meaning. And frankly, I have to tell you, from my perspective, incentives have a financial value, but I also think there's a great psychological value related to my comment just then about land. Companies generally want some buy-in. They want to be embraced. They want somebody in there with them because, you know, maybe in the public sector often we sense, well, companies have a lot of money, they just spend it, but for a lot of big companies and small companies and medium companies, this is a big decision, a lot of risk, and they want to be embraced in some way to get that buy-in. That really has significant meaning. Training, other things. So these are non-recurring costs, very valuable up front. There's more. There's water, wastewater, electricity, etc. Generally, from my perspective, we don't get too excited when, you know, there's this big incentive package, and because we got to build a water line, 5 miles to get to you, and we're interested generally in our pro forma of site development, not getting utilities there. We generally consider that sort of a public, something the public has to do. Wastewater, natural gas, etc. It's hard to locate a manufacturing project without these and having them in ample quantities where needed. Transportation infrastructure speak for itself. Recurring costs, we'll move quickly. So we talked about the non-recurring up front, but then we're going to look at things that happen over and over again. So these are utilities, electricity, employment costs, labor, wages, other things. How's that going? Training, turnover, other transportation and logistics. If we're 20 miles further away from the port, what does that mean to us in terms of a dray to the port, or et cetera? So we're going to look at the initial cost, and we're going to pro forma those incentives against it. We're going to look at the ongoing cost and try to project that out in the pro forma too. And so these non-recurring costs and recurring costs are incentives related to all these that you all, I'm certainly aware of. So a couple of things to chat about generally. This will be the fun talk time, but when are incentives bad from the company's perspective? I mean, incentives are bad, I think, from a company's perspective when they cause a company to make a dumb decision, meaning go somewhere where they don't need to be, where they're going to suffer cost-wise, labor-wise, otherwise forever. That's when I think incentives are bad. From the company's perspective, we're going to get to the public sector's perspective in a second. How important is net present value? We talked about that. I mean, it's something we do all the time. Others do ROI, but generally there's got to be some way you get these proposals from these different entities, and they're just all these pieces and parts, and you got to fold them in together and put them on the same plane, and the net present value analysis helps with that. How important is timing and negotiation? I said up front, I think negotiations begin immediately when a site search starts. Many of our competitors don't see it that way. I don't agree. Then, you do the site search, and then we'll come in and we'll negotiate the incentives. I don't see how that works. I really don't. I mean, you can do it that way, but if I'm down to one site, I don't know how I have any leverage. So, I don't know how I can innovate. Yes, sir.
To tie this notion of bad incentives with something you were just saying about land or free land, in my experience, I'd be curious to know your thoughts. I've been offered free land many times, and I almost invariably refuse it because the bad
Could be.
We have the money to pay for the land, but we deal with, but that community has to fix the roof on the elementary school, needs to buy a new fire truck. I mean, all these things come into play. You said it's an emotional issue, and I'm just curious to know if you dealt with it, again, on the company side, just saying we'd rather pay for the land and you can use that money to do other things to help us that we can't control. We can buy the land. There's other things we can't necessarily do, like speed up permits.
Yeah, and I agree and understand completely, and I think that might apply to things other than land. It really goes to how hard do we want to push these issues in a negotiation. And with our clients, we always go this way, and that way is yes, we want a really good deal, but not at the expense of goodwill. Because I see that sometimes at the expense of goodwill, and we were talking over here about bonuses based on incentives. I mean, you can drive people into the ground, right? But then the company could suffer from a PR perspective. The public entity could suffer. So I think that the key is to find a match that benefits the company and the public entity. I'm not saying that taking land is bad from my perspective, but it's just got to be a decent deal for the public entity. And we'll talk about that. I mean, it's just got to be a good deal for them. If it's not a good deal for them, and it's a really good deal for the company, ultimately I don't think it's going to be a good deal for the company. True value of incentives. Why is that important? It's just amazing to see the things you get in these proposals. And one of the most common things we see are income tax credits, right? You got income tax credits, and in Alabama, up until a couple years ago, you get 5% a year for 20 years. So $100 million project, 20 years, we get $100 million. Let's put that right in the pro forma. But the fact of the matter is there isn't necessarily, or there may not necessarily be a liability to offset and use that income tax credit. So it's important to understand from our perspective what the true value is, what the hassle factor is. Sometimes we'll recommend our clients, don't bother with this or that. It ain't worth it. Or it's going to be a public relations problem, or you just have to look at all these things.
And to be honest, that's more what I was asking was, they're offered all these things, but tax credits specifically, it's very hard. Sometimes they don't make money in the operation, or they don't know.
They have a loss carry forward of whatever's going on. Right.
It just doesn't work out. So
Right.
that's why I was asking if you had any information on how often does that happen. For us, I think I see it pretty often, especially on the tax credits.
We get calls from companies sometimes, and so maybe Dean can talk to this, but I think probably 60% of the corporate population uses some site selection expertise, and maybe 40% doesn't. I don't know if that's right. Let's call it that. And we'll get calls from people that say, well, we did all this ourselves, and by God, we can't use $20 million of this. This public entity is really, hurting us, and they didn't do their homework. They didn't understand.
Same with training can be also an area where they put a dollar value on training at the state level and recruiting. I love recruiting. Yes, and
Yeah.
pre-screening.
The one that annoys the crap out of me, and most of the jurisdictions that we work with a lot know this, is because a lot of the projects we do are manufacturing, heavy CapEx and manufacturing machinery and equipment. And so they put this huge value in for the sales tax exemption. Don't put it in there. It's a statute, just don't put it in there.
I mean, that only becomes valuable if you're looking at some entity that doesn't have it.
Exactly.
But most entities you're dealing with have it.
Yeah, but it goes to leadership, and leadership thinks they've just got $1 gazillion. Yeah.
Or they forget to tell you that you have to have UL-approved equipment brought over from Germany and installed, or you're not even going to be able to install it.
Right.
Things like that happen.
Well, that gets down to my next point is writing everything down. A lot of people we work with in states and communities in terms of our company get irritated with us. They're generally okay in the end, but they get irritated because we want them to write everything down.
Well, and I think it's really important to understand, I think particularly some of the local things, what the compliance effort is going to be, sort of like what you were saying, because, I mean, we've gone into, sometimes it's just so ridiculous. It's
Right.
like, no, we can't.
Yeah.
And often, you know, I think it's changing. It used to be like, no, we get everything approved and then we'll talk about that agreement. I was like, no, send me the agreement now.
I mean, we need to see the agreement. We need to understand clawbacks, all that good stuff. But so to me, that's one very important realm of writing it down. The other important realm is, in a deal, you might have thousands of emails. Yes, we can extend that water. Yes, the line size diameter. Yes, the gas pressure is so many psi. Yada yada. In the end, all that has to be coalesced into an MOU or some other agreement. And if you don't get it written down, and it's nobody's fault, I don't think, and they're not trying to do this, it just gets forgotten. We had a client recently who hired us to find a site, negotiate everything, and then they said, I said, we need to do an MOU, and they said, our lawyers will handle that. Don't you worry about it. And so, fine. 3 months later, they called back and they said, well, we had a $20-some million TIF, and the government's telling us that they're going to deduct the financing charges out of it. It's $6 million less. It's $17 million. Well, they didn't write it down. So they're out $6 million. So, yes.
I'd like to go back. It's a perfect place to make a comment, and I represent some large clients, and as you do.
Are you a competitor?
No, not really. I don't, anything that's too much brick and mortar and got too many.
Okay,
numbers,
keep-
I don't do that.
keep going.
So no, we're not. But I want to say this for the benefit of people listening. Take a real estate agent that is talking to somebody who wants to buy a house. Now, some real estate agents will say, well, get in the car, and they'll drive them all over town, and they'll wait for them to say, I like that. And they won't understand why they like it, but they'll just wait for them their eyes to light up. Or a real estate agent could sit there and pay attention and listen and take notes and engage mentally. You got some mind share going on there. And then they say, well, let me go, so forth. So that process, it's the way to get it done. And the best economic development people in the world, they're like the second real estate agent. Tell me.
Step one was alignment. It's whether it's what we're doing with our client or what follow, and that alignment's ongoing too, right? And for the economic development people, they either need some direct alignment, or if we provide that access, doesn't matter. They need to understand what's driving that decision.
I really don't do what you do in the space that you're in, so no, we're not competitors.
I was just kidding.
I do appreciate
Competition's good.
Very good.
Competition's good. Well, we got to get is the other 40% that aren't. Okay. MOU. I just mentioned that. You got to write stuff down. I mean, we're not trying to get lawyered out, but we just got to understand what we committed to. Because 6 months later, there's going to be new people. Somebody got transferred. We forgot. I can't remember these 1,000 emails either. We got to write it down. How to deal with political transitions. Well, this is always interesting. And if you've had a reasonably long career, you've been in a case where you did a deal and then some new leadership team came in and said, well, man, what deal? We don't know what we're talking about, And so in the biggest transactions, like I've seen, if there's like a governor's election, we're going to have the candidates sign commitments before the election so that we don't get forgotten, because that happens. Incentive follow-up. I mean, a lot of sort of like our client I just mentioned, they want to do it themselves. That's great. I applaud that. But by God, there's applications and follow-up and drop dead dates, and a lot of people call and say, I missed the deadline, and it's an issue. So do it or hire somebody to do it. Public disclosure of incentives, I mean, that's pretty important. I mean, depending on what your perspectives are, companies generally don't want their clients, not their client, their competitors knowing if they're going to try to achieve a new footprint in a product market, they're not interested, or they may be interested, frankly, if they want to scare them off. But confidentiality is really critical, so it's important that any disclosure about the project is coordinated, and incentives. I mean, we're in a day and age where these things are going to be disclosed. I just told you, we FOIA the documents. We get all the agreements for all the big deals, because if they're public, we get them. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that frequently what ends up in the newspaper about the value of a project, to your point about true value, has nothing to do with the true value.
So you followed the New York Times thing like a year or so ago? It was just, in a couple of those deals we'd worked on, and they state so authoritatively about what happened, and they're freaking clueless.
And there was that series, it was, what's her name, Story, who wrote that series, and one of the things she said about Texas gives things away, and going back to the manufacturing exemption and sales tax, that was the biggest thing that she talked about in that article. And it's like, that's not it. But you know, they'll include, what the state has, they'll talk about the income tax credits that have no value. And then there'll be things that are part of the deal that aren't public because they don't require public hearings, doesn't make that number. So you never know what the true value is.
Well, and then, so I've got some of my South Carolina friends here and my New York friend on the second row. And interestingly, in South Carolina, as an example, property tax for manufacturers is probably the 49th highest in the country, right? So they do something called fee in lieu and yada yada, and so, you know, there's all this outrage about how ridiculous these, you know, property tax incentives are, which generally don't even get them near what the other people are paying. So they just don't have perspective. They just don't have perspective. Yes, sir.
When you talk about property taxes, then the latest and greatest is the stormwater charges that they're pushing through on companies. Ridiculous. They're almost as much as property taxes sometimes. If you have impervious land, you know.
I think, you know, it's probably an offline discussion, but the real issue to me, and my home state's an example of this, is, I don't know about the politics, but the rates for homeowners who pay 1/3 what they should pay and use 3 times as much as what the manufacturer, you know, we just got to keep helping those people. And I think that some of those costs continue to be rerouted in that direction. And machines don't vote or whatever I don't know. But
All they do is redirect the water flow because you have impervious, you know, property, land sites, and it has nothing to do with, it's the same water coming down.
well, they may have some other cost doing some other part of their system that they're, you know, who knows how that's working. How important is it to publicly announce projects? Well, typically to a public entity, an announcement is sort of their income statement, right? And so we have a lot of clients say, well, why do we want to announce this? Let's just go along our way. Well, you know, these people put themselves on the line for you, and they're up against the wall a little bit, and they got to justify what they did. And so, yeah, we probably need to announce it. So that's important too.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying about good relations with the community. That
Right.
if
What's-
you're just gonna make
What's
something
their
unhappy
perspective?
politicians,
Yeah, what are their
it's a
needs?
party.
What are their needs? Yes.
I've been on both sides of this, and I think the related question isn't whether to announce, but what exactly to announce
That's a,
about the project. Like, what is that expectation of head count or CapEx and all that? Because you can get so sideways, letting the governor of X states, you know, gazillion jobs are gonna be created, maybe, you know, over the next 200 years, if everything goes well, perhaps, you know, versus what the company really thinks is feasible in the next, you know.
most
So that, I think the what to announce is as important.
most every public entity we've ever worked with, a state, for example, they're not going to publish a press release unless it's been reviewed. Maybe you've had different.
But it's the pressure on the company of saying something. That
Oh, they want as much as possible.
Okay, we'll throw you on. You can have a nice.
And then there's the other interesting thing when people come out of the woodwork and they want to be included in the press release and they didn't have anything to do with the project. That's another issue, right?
We always like an incentive where the person supposedly negotiating, supposedly signed it, generally the mayor, or the governor have no clue of any of the incentives, and they're making commitments and sound like the decision maker and signing authority. Going, oh yeah, here's specific numbers and we'll get it done, and oh my gosh, I've got a lot of power, it'll go through, don't worry about it.
Well, some governors are more involved than others. Some are really involved, some understand.
It's always fun when the mayor and the governor see each other too.
And not
Just a quick thought on the public sector's perspective. The former was the company's perspective, but from the public sector's perspective, I think it's do good deals and don't do dumb deals, and have some understanding of the impacts of what's coming in and what that means and how much risk you can take in that regard, and being informed. So there are times we negotiate with public entities, and I really don't think they have a clue what they're doing. And others are really understanding the impacts. It just depends. But, you know, they have a fiduciary duty to their citizens and all those good things, and they should only do, this is really, maybe we'll have to adjust, risk-adjusted investment and related returns essential. That means don't do dumb deals. That's what that means. Okay. Okay, I got about 5 more minutes.
Well, can I add one thing there?
Please.
Thank you. Make sure that whether it's the state person, the local person, that they understand their incentives. I mean, some places have really great people. Other times, they're not particularly sophisticated. And, you know, at least I know enough to ask questions. But then it gets back to where you get the bad deals. But yeah, sometimes it's really technical, but people need to work through it on both sides.
We're negotiating a site now in a very rural area, and we've structured an arrangement. We're going to lease the building and the property, and all we're going to pay are school taxes. Everything else is gone. And we keep asking the entities, public entities, to run the pro forma for us. Because so many times, if you don't see their pro forma, there's some assumption you weren't aware of or whatever. And by God, they just can't run their own numbers. They can't run their own numbers, and they, well, will you run them for us? And no. I mean, we've got ours, but what are yours? So, because when you do something like that, what happens is, later on, there's something, well, of course we need to do this many mills, and you just didn't know. So, okay, summary of public sector. Use incentives when they make a difference, right? When they positively influence a decision. That's important. Understand the liabilities and assets of the competing locations. Hence the story about going to the place, no drill rig, no, I mean, you sort of have to understand. If I'm negotiating with a state that has high property tax, or I'm competing with a state that has high property taxes, I want to know what that other system is. And when if somebody like me or the company says, my God, your property tax offer isn't much compared to X, well, you say, well, that's because they're upside down on the net. And let me explain it to you. Financial strengths of the entities requesting incentives. Okay, well, you got to look at the companies. I mean, are they worth recruiting? It's all back to an informed decision. Are they likely to stay? Do you have them anchored? So on and so forth. All right, I'm gonna just make one more comment, and then maybe we got 2 minutes for a question. We're done. This labor availability, sophistication piece is very important. I just threw this slide in because it's on the mind of CEOs and other executives in terms of we've got this very, very capital intensive system that's going on. It's a 45-degree line item in terms of dollar invested per employee. If we want to compete with, as the U.S., with Mexico or China or this or that, we got to wring more value out of each employee. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, they got to create more value if they want to be compensated. And so this training issue and this, availability of skills is a real serious concern for 63% of CEOs. and this is probably 14 or 14 data, an increase of 5%. It's probably up another 5 or 10%. It's probably even more than that, okay? If you want to read a really good article about incentives and economic development, a good idea or a bad idea, that picture's about 10 years old. We had some new pictures taken last week, and I really don't want to use them because they look like I am, not like I was. But anyway, this link here is to a business facilities article we did on this, which might be interesting reading, might not be. Okay. So that's all I have, but I'd love to chat for whatever time I have left. Yes, sir.
Well, after, watching all of these, it sounds like all of these is like quantitative stuff that you can put on Excel sheet and just basically come up with a number for comparison, for decision making and everything. It's a cost-driven thing. But, the experience we had in the past, and I don't see like much people talk about, is the regulations of the location. Could be either like county enforced, it could be state enforced, or federal enforced. That doesn't matter. The Excel sheet is saying something, but when it comes to that regulation, really, when you get particular about some details, there really should be a leader. In your decision making. For instance, like the stormwater you said, in my site selection I saw, it says it's a one-time cost. It's not a one-time cost. It's a continued cost and everything like that. Some stupid regulations like the number of trees per square foot and everything like that for landscaping.
Right.
Or can you use like well water? You have to use city water. Or when it comes to, for instance, like the hazmat, and when it comes to some like your chemicals, how you store it, how you dispose it, that kind of stuff. Or when it comes to the quality of the city water, like ppm, what is it? They're like cost, really, they're cost driven. You have to just, take a look at it, and the regulations are not just basically stable. There are lots of fluctuation. You cannot basically cost it. No matter like how many Excel sheets you put out there, and we did this in past, and we were very successful in just finding all of these out. Just have a good provision of all the costs that will come through. But when you choose your site, when you go there, you really get surprised that it's not in your hand. And you cannot fit it in anywhere in your Excel sheet.
A couple of comments. Agree with you totally. 2 points. One is the alignment. If water quality is an issue or other things are an issue, that has to be in that alignment and your needs, and you have to run that through the process. When I started, I said we have generally 2 lists. One is qualitative, one is quantitative. And this is mostly quantitative, but there is clearly a very qualitative piece. It depends. We literally had one nutraceutical company that was owned by a family, and we were searching for the concentration of Target stores because the CEO's wife liked to shop at Target. So it just depends. But the qualitative it's got to feel good. One thing that's killed a lot of deals that you can't put your arms around, it just didn't feel right. It's just so. All right, I should probably sign off, but I really enjoyed the time with you, and we'll see you tonight and tomorrow, and would love to chat some more. Thanks.